Welcome, dear viewers and listeners, to Embrace the Echo Grief Talks. This is a podcast that's dedicated to the exploration of grief and loss. My name is Shay.
I'm Stephanie. We are your host and companion in this journey of healing and understanding. Grief is a journey that often feels isolating, but it's a journey that each of us will inevitably experience, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the dissolution of a dream. Grief touches us in profound ways. Despite its universality, grief remains one of the most misunderstood and overlooked aspects of human experience.
In this podcast, we aim to change that. We invite you to join us as we create a space for open and honest conversations about grief. These are conversations that will honor the stories of loss, celebrate the memories of those we've lost, and provide insights and understanding to those who are navigating their own journey of grief.
Whether you're in the midst of your own grief journey, supporting a loved one through theirs, or simply seeking to deepen your understanding of this universal experience, we invite you to join us on Embracing the Echo. Together, let's honor the echoes of our grief, find solace in shared stories, and embrace the healing power of connection.
Please stay tuned for heartfelt conversations, insightful reflections, and compassionate guidance as we journey through grief together here on Embrace the Echo Grief Talks.
Welcome to our first episode of Embrace the Echo. In today's episode, we will explore the power of talking about grief as it opens the door to various impactful and meaningful insights.
Yes, there is indeed so much to talk about, Ati Steph, and we can use this platform to bring about that awareness and really breaking the stigma surrounding grief. To have this open space, we can share our stories and insights. And so, with that being said, we've prepared each other some questions to answer. So, ready ka na ba, ate?
Let's do this.
Let's do this. Great. I have a first question to you. Why is it important to talk about grief?
Death is an inevitable part of life. Though it happens all the time, it is still difficult for most people to talk about it, especially if it involves losing a loved one due to a sudden death. As a result, some people tend to isolate themselves to avoid dealing with their feelings, can also exaggerate their feelings. Grief is a natural response to loss, be it someone or something, and the most severe is over losing a loved one. It could get overwhelming to a point that it may affect our daily lives, such as sleep problems, appetite, difficulty in making decisions, dissociation, meaning not wanting to go out or be with anyone. And that's why it's important to talk about grief. Though the process in dealing with grief varies for everyone, it's ideal to talk about it. Isolating and holding it back could actually cause more damage than harm. Talking, just like me, it allows people to express and understand their feelings. It is a way to resolve issues associated with loss and feelings such as guilt, shame, anger, and longing.
Thank you, Ate Steph, for sharing that.
I have a question for you. What is grief and why is it a universal human experience?
By definition, based on my own research from various sources, it is described as something that is multifaceted, complex. It touches on different aspects of the personal, emotional, physical, cognitive, social, spiritual aspects of the person. As like you said, it is a normal response. In fact, a natural instinct that we have ever since, as a child growing up. This is our body's natural response to loss, and typically arising from that death of a loved one. So it can also be triggered by other significant life-changing events, such as loss of a job, a career, end of a relationship, divorce, separation, loss of independence, miscarriages, stillbirths, other cultural or environmental changes too. By definition, but my own personal definition of grief actually resonates well with Dr. Edith Eger. I'm not sure if you know her, but she's one of the Holocaust survivor and a psychologist who deals with trauma and grief. She defined it as grief is often not about what happened, it's about what did not happen. And this is one of her quote from her book, The Gift. For me, I can resonate with that very well because just because we have this primary loss, which was, losing the twins during my pregnancy, there were a lot of secondary losses that came along with that. I felt like I had the loss of identity. I did not know who I was. I was questioning whether if I was considered a mother.
Mm.
There's also loss of hopes and dreams that came with it, of how I envisioned my motherhood would look like with the twins and the hopes and dreams for them to be growing up with their cousins. So all of those loss of hopes and dreams affected me so much. Another thing that I can say that I've lost was the loss of purpose and meaning of life. I did not know how to keep moving forward with my life. At one point I felt really, really stuck. I questioned whether I could continue to practice nursing, considering I had so much triggers during my pregnancy at work, as it was during the midst of COVID as well. So reflecting back on all of that, I was actually grieving a lot of things. It made sense now why I had such a difficulty with my grief, especially during the first year of it. But why is grief a universal human experience? As human beings, we are wired to actually have that social connection with others. We do start to build that sense of attachment. And when we form that attachment to that person, place, or things, the inevitable loss of that separation. For me, one way I cope with that, with my grief and this idea of attachment, was to actually challenge that and explored my understanding about the impermanence of life. Nothing lasts forever, and that anything with life will somehow face death. We as human beings are not exempt from that. So I think that notion really helped me cope.
How does society's avoidance of discussing grief contribute to the stigma surrounding it?
So let me tell you an experience that I had. This happened actually within the first year after our losses. Someone once told me, "You're still talking about them?" And them was referring to, my twin
Yeah.
boys and the story of what happened to me. And to me, hearing that comment was quite dismissive. I felt offended. Actually, I was hurt, and I felt that I should just move on with it. Like, what's wrong with me talking about what happened to me, right? But the truth is, my experience and my grief was real. But because our society tells us to grieve a certain way, or perhaps they felt that there's a certain timeline, to this grieving process, and that I was supposed to be moved on or over it by the end of the year, I was forced to just suck it up and just go back and end up in isolation. I was like, no, this shouldn't be the case, because you cannot really put a timeline to grief because everybody's so different, right? But the society's avoidance of discussing grief, based on my experience, it could actually lead to two things: increased sense of isolation, feeling of loneliness in their grief. And I think that when there is that lack of understanding on what grief is and how to support a person grieving, this can actually make it more challenging for the person. The person grieving will have that sense of increased pressure to conform to the social norms expectation of grief. I feel like in our society today, we are so consumed by the busyness of our everyday, the demand to keep up with our job. For someone who is grieving, whether that's a fresh loss or those with prolonged grief, sometimes we may feel pressured to keep ignoring this grief inside us in order to keep living because our jobs and roles demands more from us. So this pressure to conform to the social norms leave us no space for that grief. The more we suppress the emotions, the longer we're holding on to it, right? And that
Yes.
can actually further delay the healing and process of grief.
Yeah, actually, it makes me think of my experience. Just like listening to what you're saying, going through all these ideas and insights, even if I have been a widow for 20 years, almost very close.
So, Ate Steph, I do have a next question for you. The question is, how does the lack of the conversation about grief impact individuals and communities?
Ignoring grief and our feelings, is not going to help us get to the other side of grief. Making conversations are important in ways that will impact us, our families, and communities. I'm saying it like this because I'm speaking for myself, my experience. And the lack of conversation, I guess, was a me problem as well. In my grief, I felt I had nowhere to go. I just couldn't find that space to be comfortable enough to get understood, right? Grief needs a place to go. Though it may have felt like I've been stuck for so long, I've always said that I feel very lost. Like I've always said, I'm still trying to find my way home. And I was really very lonely. But then, yeah, we need an outlet, to let go of our emotions, our feelings. Discussing grief can be done in many ways, which I have actually done. I've seen psychiatrists, and also there are options like counselors or mentors or personal coaching. But as the years had passed, I never got to connect much with my psychiatrist. We could also talk to friends and family, but in some way, in my personal experience, I just would find myself pulling away. What I'm trying to say is, in my experience of my grief, there was that lack of conversation. I got to a certain state where I finally was ready to open up. Now, with Purple Hearts, with UDRiVe, I've seen the benefit of what it is to talk about how we feel. Because if not, there's that thing called incomplete grief experience, which I have realized as I reflected on all these questionnaires for our podcast, right? I experienced very incomplete grief. And that is why I think it could impact, because it doesn't bring a total understanding to everybody. People get to misunderstand because the lack of explaining or talking about it.
Thank you. I mean, it is valid points that you pointed out there. It really brings light to the our personal stories, and that will really help us heal moving
Yeah.
forward, right? And really integrate those losses
Yeah.
that we've had. So thank you for sharing that, Latte.
I have a question for you. Why do you think grief is often treated as a taboo subject?
That's a great question. Actually, reflecting on this question was really deep for me. I have to really go back, not just within myself, but really looking back at the previous generations, right? Grief is often a taboo subject because there are so many associated emotions with it that most people are not comfortable with,
Mm,
right? So emotions such as anger, sadness, guilt, shame, the
yeah.
sense of rejection, these are oftentimes an emotions that are so intense, especially right after a loss, from the early days of and weeks and months of losses, that most people tend to avoid these feelings, the denial. Another reason is the idea of fearing death and loss in general. Experiencing a death in a family or a loved one can trigger one's own thoughts and perception about their own death. I remember actually growing up as a kid in the Philippines, there was something about death that felt scary for me. I seem to imagine that when someone dies, their spirit or ghost will hunt you. Like kapag araw ng patay or All Souls Day, for some reason, every time it's around that time of the year, we start telling scary stories during the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day,
Right.
opening
Right.
cemeteries. And then every time I would walk, I forgot what it's called. Basta yung where the dead people are. Sometimes I would imagine a skeleton will come out of the ground and would just start chasing me. I guess I got that from like the movies, right?
Right.
I remember the news, they start talking about scary things. For me, there was that sense of like something scary about it. I mean, that's my experience at least. But perhaps there's also that sense of, would death be painful when that time comes for me? I actually thought of that growing up. And I guess ever since there's that sense of curiosity, but there's something scary about this. So I don't know if I should even explore or, be curious about that. And it's not something that people talk about. Anyway, so yun yung nasense ko growing up. But another thing I want to point out is that, the cultural or society stigma about grief. Our culture taught us that it's not polite to show weakness and be vulnerable, that we have to be strong or about what happened to us. That
Exactly.
crying would mean that we are weak and that there's an acceptable length of time to be grieving. People end up shaming us for it. That's why I think most people grieve in isolation. So, which is we know now that it's not a healthy way to grieve.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I have realized enough to say that it's good to talk. It's
Mm.
good. It's good to talk. And in order for one to heal is, yeah, to talk, and it's important.
It's good to talk, but choosing the right people to talk
People.
to
Yeah.
is key, right? And I think now, now that we found each other, we found UDRiVe, we have a space where we can be safe, feel safe, and not feel judged or being shamed for all the things we've experienced. It really helps facilitate that healing journey and processing that grief. I have a next question for you at this, Steph. So, how can an open conversation about grief contribute to normalizing the experience?
Well, then, just like a while ago, you said that it also depends on who we talk to. The thing with stigma, that thing is so real. And I've realized that it was the only way for me to heal that I never had an opportunity to. And whereas now, it's actually a bit uncomfortable, but I feel confident that it's okay to talk because talking is healing. Talking about grief can help you find the support you need, especially when you talk to people with lived experience, because then you get to share the same emotion, and then maybe you can toss and turn with those aspects where it's kind of troublesome for others to understand. Having that person or having that safe space when you feel safe to be at your most vulnerable and know that you're understood and you're not alone makes such a difference. This that I realized in my experience with the right people, I have felt so safe to share, and I didn't feel like I was an alien from another world here with UDRiVe and Purple Hearts. That's why I'm very excited, even if it's kind of awkward for me to be talking so much or, sharing information about my personal life. I'm just excited because, in a way, it helps me as well for all the years that I have kept my grief to myself.
Thank you. This is why, with UDRiVe, we are pretty much with each other, right? We're all kind of healing together. And it's that space in the community that we need. So I'm happy and glad to be part of that healing journey with you. My next question to you, Ate Steph, is in what ways can discussing grief openly contribute to mental health awareness?
The situation and painful memories will never improve by avoiding it. I've learned this for so long, and only now I'm actually kind of brave enough to come out in the open that I was such a big chicken before. Discussions on grief could stop negative emotions, destructive behaviors. Grief can be a very lonely place. Yeah, it could be a lonely place, and this is also probably why I'm always easily to cry, because it's only now that I'm starting to open up and I'm realizing that it's okay not to be okay. It helps reaffirm, challenge, and update our beliefs on life and death. And it gives us the opportunity to re examine our grief. Universal beliefs or philosophies about death and loss bring us a better understanding of ourselves and of what happened to us. It can also prevent us from seeking solace in a harmful lifestyle, just as I have alcoholism, drug addiction, eating disorders, overspending. It could also bottle up emotions enough to highlight on anger issues, trust issues, depression, anxiety, the deep sense of emptiness, suicide. It's beneficial to mental health because it's good to understand these things, because a lot of things that we go through that we hide or we're ashamed about comes back to us in many other ways. Those are just my thoughts in my own words.
There was a lot that you had to unpack there. I commend you for being so brave. Virtual hugs, okay? We're
Thank
here. We're here for you, and thank you for being
you.
so brave and sharing that. We all have a vulnerable story to tell, and just you showing up for yourself first and really acknowledging all those experiences that you've gone through is
Mhm.
huge. It's so huge. So I want to acknowledge that and value your presence here and for sharing that with us, with
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you for also giving me this opportunity.
Of
You
course.
know, how does the acknowledgement of grief positively impact emotional well being?
Great question. When we acknowledge grief, it actually helps promote emotional well-being through a lot of things. I have 4 points I'm going to share. First point is, validating those emotions. For me, my emotions are real and that they are true and normal response to our grief. Realizing I was not crazy and that I was not alone experiencing that. When you're sharing your story or your grief to another safe person, it actually brings that sense of validating that emotion, that hearing that, okay, we're not alone on this. We all experience this, and it's a normal response, right? Another point is reducing the isolation, so people will feel less alone, especially when we find that safe space where social connection can be maintained, most importantly, without any judgment and shame. Third point I have here is really encouraging healthy coping mechanisms, allowing our grief and emotions to be confronted, felt, and processed. All of this will help promote healthy grieving. Just to piggyback on this point, I know you shared something from your end where you coped in different ways that perhaps may not be healthy. It was actually just causing the delay of that healing. It was just prolonging it. I realized this for myself that life is so fragile that even just the life of my boys inside me, them having to go so soon, that's life there. And that was just so short, and that can easily be, gone. Even if you're processing your grief 10, 20 years after the loss, it's never too late. I think it's just really knowing that you have that space, that resources, that can provide you that safe environment to be. And another point is fostering that supportive environment. Like I said, when we talk openly about grief, people will likely seek support from friends, family, and professionals to help them navigate the challenges of loss, and in recognizing the need to process the healthy grieving. And it starts by just talking about it. It's like really bringing light to the lived experience, the true lived experience of that individual. We're breaking that taboo, right? We're breaking
Exactly. Exactly.
that's why we're here, and this is why this podcast is actually here. It's one way to help normalize that grief. Those are the 4 points that I have.
It actually makes sense, and listening to what you're saying, it brings me back to my experience as well. And it's not all about me. Our stories can actually help people, and it's always good to talk about it. So yes, thank you so much for being a part of this time.
Thank you. I always value this conversation. I think we had a great conversation today. So thank you for your time. Just for closing, we are grateful for you who's watching and listening us today, for
Yes.
joining us on this profound exploration, the power of talking about grief. So as we wrap up this episode, we are reminded that by opening up conversations about grief, just like this, we not only honor the memories of those we've lost, but also cultivate a shared understanding of the human experience. So, in the echoes of our conversations, we do find our strength, our resilience, and the realization that although grief can be isolating, the power of connection can bridge that gap between sorrow and healing.
And before we say our goodbyes, I want to leave you with a thought. Every story shared, every tear shed, and every moment of vulnerability contributes to a collective tapestry of compassion. By talking openly about grief, we break down the barriers of the silence that can build, creating spaces where empathy and understanding can flourish. If you've been moved by today's episode, I encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your own stories, listen to others, and be a source of support for those navigating their grief journey. Remember, it's okay not to have all the answers. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply be present for one another.
Yes. So as we embrace the echoes of today's discussion, let's carry forward the awareness, the insights, and the compassion that comes from understanding the power of talking about grief.
Thank you for being a part of Embrace the Echo. Until next time, take care, be kind to yourself, and may the echoes of the understanding guide you to your journey through grief. This is Stephanie, and with my co host, Shay, signing off for Embrace the Echo Grief Talk.